Good morning. And I say that knowing very well that for some of you, simply hearing the word judgment this morning may already feel tiring. You may be saying within yourself, "Oh, no, not another talk about judgment and forgiveness. I already know I shouldn't judge. I already know I should forgive." And perhaps some of you are even thinking, "I've been trying for years." And so let us begin by being very honest with one another. This is not a sermon about becoming better people. It is not a lesson in religious etiquette. It is not an appeal to behave more nicely, speak more softly, or think more charitable thoughts about one another. If that were all it was, you could stop listening now, because most of you already know how to do that, and most of you already know how exhausting it is to keep trying. No, what we are speaking of this morning is not morality, it is freedom. We are not gathered here to learn how to suppress judgment. We are here to learn why judgment has power over us at all, and how that power can be taken away without effort, without struggle, and without self-condemnation. Because condemnation, you see, whether directed outward or inward, is still condemnation. And condemnation never healed anyone. Now, the Master said something very strange, and he said it very simply. Judge not, that ye be not judged. And for centuries, men have turned that into a rule, a commandment, a moral demand. Don't judge. Don't judge. Don't judge. And yet, the more we tell ourselves not to judge, the more we find ourselves doing it, sometimes even judging ourselves for judging others. So clearly, the Master was not giving us a rule. He was revealing a law. A law is not something you obey by willpower. A law is something that operates whether you believe it or not. And the law revealed here is this. Judgment binds you to the very thing you are judging. Judgment keeps you in reaction. Judgment makes you dependent on appearances. Judgment ties your peace to the behavior, opinions, failures, or sins of someone else. And that, my friends, is bondage. Now let us be very clear from the beginning. Judgment does not make you a bad person. Judgment does not make you unspiritual. Judgment simply reveals that somewhere in consciousness, you still believe there is a power outside of God. That is all it means. Nothing more and nothing less. Because whenever we judge, what are we really saying? We are saying, this thing I see has the power to disturb me. This person has the power to upset me. This situation has the power to rob me of peace. And whether we know it or not, we have just bowed down to a second power. The scripture says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and we have usually thought that meant idols of wood or stone. But the most common idol is not something we kneel before, it is something we react to. Anything you react to, you have granted authority. Anything you fear, resent, condemn, or mentally prosecute has been lifted up as a power in your experience. And so judgment is not merely unkind, it is idolatry. Now do not recoil at that word. We are not condemning ourselves here. We are uncovering something so that it can lose its grip. Remember, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Not effort, not discipline, truth. We must understand that judgment feels necessary to the human mind. It feels protective. It feels wise. It feels like discernment. But very often, judgment is simply fear dressed up as righteousness. It is the mind saying, if I label this, analyze this, condemn this, I will be safe. But safety does not come from judgment. Safety comes from dwelling in the consciousness of love. The Master did not say, try harder to love. He said, love is the fulfilling of the law. Love is not something you manufacture. Love is what governs when you stop trying to govern yourself and others through thought. And so the purpose of this teaching is not to make you passive, naive, or permissive. It is to free you from the exhausting job of being the judge, the jury, and the executioner in your own mind. It is to lift from your shoulders the impossible task of managing the universe through opinion. The prophet Micah asked, "What doth the Lord require of thee?" And the answer was not complexity. It was not struggle. It was not vigilance. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Walk humbly, not patrol aggressively. Now here is the sting, and it is gentle, but it is sharp. If judgment is still active in us, it is not because we are failing spiritually. It is because we are still seeking power in the wrong place. We are still trying to live by thought. We are still trying to secure peace by managing appearances. And that is why judgment exhausts us. Peace does not come from fixing the world. Peace comes from relinquishing the false belief that the world is ours to fix. The good news, and there is very good news, is that there is one move, one inner shift that ends reactivity at its root, not by suppression, not by denial, but by a quiet inward turning that removes judgment's authority altogether. That move does not begin in the heat of conflict. It begins in consciousness itself, and that is where we will go next. Now, let us go a little deeper, because unless this is understood, the rest of what we say will sound like beautiful advice, and it will not transform life. The contrast between judgment and love is not a contrast between two behaviors. It is not even a contrast between two attitudes. It is the contrast between two laws under which human beings attempt to live. Most of the world lives under the law of judgment. It may call it discernment, wisdom, realism, or moral responsibility, but it is still judgment. It is the belief that life must be measured, evaluated, corrected, punished, or rewarded by the human mind in order to function properly. Under this law, peace is conditional. Safety is conditional. Love is conditional. Everything depends on whether the world behaves as it should. Under this law, we are always watching people, watching ourselves, watching outcomes, watching for danger, watching for failure, watching for betrayal. And even when nothing appears to be wrong, there is a subtle tension because judgment must always be ready. Judgment cannot rest. And then the Master comes and says something utterly revolutionary. Love your enemies, not tolerate them, not manage them, not correct them inwardly while smiling outwardly. Love them. Now, no one who understands human psychology would ever give such a command as a moral requirement. It would be cruel. It would be impossible. And therefore, it was not a moral command at all. It was a revelation of another law. Love is not something you do. Love is something that governs when you step out from under judgment. The scripture tells us God is love. Not that God possesses love, not that God demonstrates love. God is love, which means that love is not a human emotion. It is the nature of divine being. And when love governs consciousness, something very specific happens. Judgment loses jurisdiction. Paul understood this when he wrote, "Love worketh no ill to his neighbor." Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Not fulfilling the law by effort, but fulfilling it by rendering all other laws unnecessary. You see, when love governs, there is no need to judge. Judgment exists only where fear exists. Judgment exists only where we believe something must be defended, protected, or controlled. Love does not defend itself. Love does not protect itself. Love does not control. Love is, now let us be very honest. When we hear the word love in religious settings, many of us flinch a little. It has been sentimentalized. It has been weakened. It has been turned into emotional kindness or passive niceness. But the love of which the Master speaks is not soft. It is not indulgent. It is not blind. Love is law. And law does not negotiate. Law does not react. Law does not argue. Law simply is. And everything aligns with it or suffers the consequences of resistance. When Jesus stood before Pilate, he did not defend himself. That was not weakness. That was law. He was not living under the law of appearances, accusations, or outcomes. He was living under the law of love. And under that law, Pilate had no real authority at all. "Thou couldst have no power at all against me," he said, "except it were given thee from above." Now, this is not poetry. This is metaphysics. This is spiritual law. And until we understand that judgment and love are mutually exclusive governments of consciousness, we will continue trying to mix them, judging inwardly while pretending to love outwardly, forgiving verbally while condemning silently. And that inner contradiction is what drains us. You cannot live under two laws at once. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot live by love while secretly relying on judgment for safety. One will always undermine the other. This is why judgment feels so compelling. It promises order. It promises protection. It promises justice, but it never delivers peace. Because peace is not the result of correct evaluation. Peace is the result of right alignment. The prophet Isaiah tells us, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee." Stayed not busy, stayed not reactive, stayed not rehearsing arguments. Judgment keeps the mind moving. Love lets the mind rest. Now, notice this carefully. Love does not say nothing matters. Love says only God matters. And when only God matters, appearances lose their authority to disturb. Judgment says, this must change before I can be at peace. Love says, peace is present now, and from that peace, right action may appear. Judgment looks outward for cause. Love abides inwardly as cause. That is why the Master could say, "Why take ye thought?" He was not condemning thought. He was exposing its misuse as power. Thought is a tool. Love is law. And when thought tries to become law, it becomes tyranny over ourselves first, and then over others. So the real question before us is not, how do I stop judging? That is the wrong question. The right question is, under which law am I living right now? Am I living under the law of reaction, evaluation, and mental control? Or am I living under the law of love, which asks nothing of the world in order to be whole? Because the moment love becomes the law of your consciousness, judgment does not need to be fought. It falls away the way darkness falls away when light is present. And that is why this teaching is not about improving behavior. It is about changing governments. Now we come to a point where honesty is required, gentle honesty, but honesty nonetheless, because judgment does not arise out of nothing. It is not an accident. It is not a flaw in your character. Judgment is born of a desire, and until that desire is uncovered, judgment will simply take new forms. Most people believe they judge because they care, or because they are responsible, or because they are discerning. But if we look more deeply, very quietly, very sincerely, we discover that judgment is almost always rooted in a desire for something the human mind believes it lacks. Sometimes it is a desire for safety. Sometimes it is a desire for control. Sometimes it is a desire to feel right, or superior, or justified. Sometimes it is the desire to protect an identity that feels threatened. And sometimes, if we are very honest, it is the desire to punish. Now, do not recoil from that word. Punishment does not always look violent. Punishment can look like withholding love. It can look like silent resentment. It can look like replaying someone's failure over and over again in thought. It can look like moral distance. It can look like, I forgive you, but I will never see you the same way again. That is punishment. The human mind believes quite sincerely that if it does not judge, something terrible will happen. Chaos will reign. Evil will go unchecked. Boundaries will dissolve. And so judgment presents itself as necessary, even virtuous. But Scripture tells us something entirely different. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. This was never meant to comfort us with the idea that God will punish better than we can. It was meant to free us from the burden of punishment altogether. It was meant to say, the universe does not require your judgment in order to be governed. There is already a law in operation, one far more intelligent than your fear. But judgment persists because it feeds the ego. Judgment gives the ego something to do. It gives it a role, a function, a purpose. I am the one who knows. I am the one who sees clearly. I am the one who is not fooled. And as long as that role is active, the ego feels alive. And this is why judgment can feel strangely energizing, even addictive. You may notice that when judgment is active, there is a sense of intensity, urgency, and even righteousness. But afterward, there is exhaustion, there is heaviness, there is a subtle loss of peace. Because judgment consumes life. It does not generate it. The Master told us, I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. And abundant life is not compatible with constant mental prosecution. Now let us look even deeper. Beneath judgment is not only desire. Beneath desire is fear. Fear that if I do not judge, I will be hurt again. Fear that if I do not judge, I will be taken advantage of. Fear that if I do not judge, I will lose my sense of self. But fear itself is already a confession that we are living under the assumption of separation. Perfect love casteth out fear. Not better reasoning, not stronger boundaries, not sharper discernment. Perfect love. Fear cannot be argued away. Fear dissolves only when the sense of separation dissolves. And judgment is one of the primary ways we maintain that sense of separation. Judgment says, I am here and you are there. I am right and you are wrong. I am safe and you are dangerous. Love says, there is only one. Now, this does not mean that all behavior is acceptable or that wisdom is unnecessary. It means that wisdom does not arise from fear. Wisdom arises from union. Wisdom arises when we stop needing to defend a personal sense of self. And this is why judgment so often returns even after we forgive. We forgive the action, but we keep the identity. We forgive what was done, but we continue to define the person by it. And as long as we do that, judgment has not actually been released. It has merely been postponed. The scripture says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And righteous judgment is not condemnation. Righteous judgment is recognition of truth. It is seeing through appearances to what is eternally real. But the human mind cannot do this by effort. The human mind can only rearrange appearances. It can only move pieces on the board. It cannot see through the board itself. And so judgment continues, because the mind believes it must protect something fragile, me, my reputation, my peace, my values, my safety, my worth. Yet the moment you glimpse, even faintly, that your true identity is not fragile, not personal, not at risk, the need to judge begins to loosen. If your life is hid with Christ in God, as Paul tells us, then what exactly are you defending? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Want, lack, need is the soil in which judgment grows. Where there is no want, there is no need to judge. So we do not uproot judgment by attacking it. We uproot it by discovering what we have been trying to get from it and allowing God to be that instead. And that leads us to the next great turning point in this teaching, the realization that the true battle is not between you and another person at all. It is between two assumptions of power. Now we come to a place where, if you're willing to stay with me, something very important can happen. Because until this point, it may still seem as though the problem is other people, other people's behavior, other people's sins, other people's ignorance, other people's failures. And as long as that seems to be the battlefield, judgment will continue to feel justified. But the battlefield is not out there. The battle is not between you and another person. It is not between you and a situation. It is not between you and the world. The battle, if we may even use that word, is between two assumptions of power that cannot coexist. One assumption is that there are two powers, good and evil, harmony and discord, God and something opposed to God. Under this assumption, vigilance is required, judgment is required, defense is required, reaction is required. Life becomes a continual effort to manage forces. The other assumption, the one revealed by the Christ, is that there is only one power. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Now, this is not a theological statement. It is not doctrine. It is not philosophy. It is a statement of being. It is a description of reality. And until this is understood, not intellectually, but inwardly, judgment will always seem necessary. Because if there are two powers, you must choose sides. You must identify enemies. You must protect yourself. You must decide who is right and who is wrong. Judgment becomes survival. But if there is only one power, judgment collapses. You see, judgment is impossible in a universe governed by one power. There is nothing to judge against. There is no opposing force to condemn. There is no rival authority to fear. There is only misperception, and misperception has no power of its own. This is why the Master could look at sickness, sin, hatred, betrayal, even death, and not react. He did not deny appearances. He simply did not grant them authority. He lived from the standpoint of I and my Father are one. Now, notice something very subtle here. He did not say, I and my Father are united in purpose or aligned in values. He said one life, one power, one being. And from that standpoint, what could threaten him when we judge? We are confessing, however unconsciously, that we believe in a second power. We are saying, this thing I see has an authority that God does not have. And then we wonder why peace escapes us. Paul understood this clearly when he wrote, there is no power but of God, not greater power, not ultimate power, no power, period. And yet we live as though there are many powers, germs, personalities, systems, opinions, past mistakes, future fears, other people's sins, other people's judgments of us. All of these become powers in our experience because we accept them as such. Judgment is the mechanism by which we accept them. Now, let me say this very plainly. You cannot end judgment by deciding to be kinder. You end judgment by withdrawing belief in a power other than God. Judgment is not a moral problem. It is a metaphysical one. This is why spiritual teaching does not begin with behavior. It begins with consciousness. If you believe that evil is power, you will react to it. If you believe that fear is power, you will organize your life around avoiding it. If you believe that another person's opinion has power, you will live in anxiety or resentment, and judgment will feel not only natural, but necessary. But if you begin even tentatively to entertain the truth that God is the only power, something shifts. Reaction begins to slow. Judgment begins to loosen, not because you are trying to be spiritual, but because there is nothing left to react to in the same way. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? This is not bravado, it is logic. If God is light, what authority does darkness have? If God is salvation, what authority does danger have? Now, this does not mean that appearances disappear overnight. The world does not suddenly become gentle and well-behaved. But your relationship to it changes, and that is everything. When there are two powers, you are always fighting or fleeing. When there is one power, you are abiding. And abiding does not mean inaction. It means action without fear. It means response without reaction. It means movement without struggle. Judgment thrives on the belief that something must be done before peace can be present. Oneness reveals that peace is present, and from that peace, right action unfolds. This is why Jesus could say, "Be still and know that I am God." Not be still so that God will arrive. Be still and know, recognize, acknowledge that God already is. And here is the liberating truth. The moment you stop fighting appearances as though they were powers, you stop needing to judge them. They may still require wisdom, compassion, or practical response, but not condemnation. The moment you realize that the battle is not with people, but with a false belief in two powers, you stop trying to fix others in order to feel safe. You begin to rest. And from that rest, a very specific inner capacity emerges, the capacity to pause, and that pause is the doorway to the one move that ends reactivity altogether. Now we are ready to speak of something very practical, so practical that if it is misunderstood, it will be dismissed as too simple. And yet, if it is understood, it will change the whole texture of your life. Most people believe that spiritual work is something you do when trouble appears, when the words are spoken, when the insult lands, when the betrayal is revealed, when the fear arises. Then, so we think we must do something spiritual. We must remember a truth. We must apply a principle. We must control our reaction. And almost always we fail, not because we are weak, not because we are unspiritual, but because we are trying to perform spiritual work at the wrong time and from the wrong level. The Master never taught reaction management. He taught consciousness. You cannot, in the heat of emotional surge, suddenly manufacture non-reaction. You cannot, at the peak of mental pressure, suddenly decide not to judge if judgment has been your habitual government. You cannot improvise peace. Peace must already be present. This is why Jesus said, "Take no thought for the morrow." He did not mean neglect responsibility. He meant do not postpone alignment. Do not wait for crisis to decide where your life is governed from. The one move that ends reactivity is not a technique used in the moment. It is a condition of consciousness established before the moment ever arises. And this is where many sincere students become discouraged. They say, "I know the truth, but when the situation comes, I still react." And they assume this means failure. It does not. It means you are still building the consciousness in which truth can operate naturally. Remember what the Master said, the kingdom of God is within you. He did not say it arrives on demand. He said it must be entered, dwelt in, abided in. Consciousness is not created by emergency. It is revealed by practice. Now let us understand this clearly. The ego believes that life happens to it unexpectedly, and it must respond quickly to survive. Spirit knows that nothing ever comes to you unprepared for. Spirit precedes every appearance. Spirit is already present before the storm forms. This is why Isaiah could say, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." The answer is not delayed. It is we who are delayed in listening. So the one move begins with a radical shift. We stop living as emergency responders to life. We stop waiting for problems to tell us who we are. We stop allowing circumstances to define our posture. Instead, we begin the day by yielding government. Every morning, quietly, simply, we relinquish the throne. We give back to God what was never ours to manage: our safety, our reputation, our outcomes, our righteousness, our sense of being right. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. Not later, now. This is not a prayer of words. It is an inner yielding, a soft but decisive surrender of authorship. Now here is where the human mind protests. It says, "But what if something happens? What if I need to act? What if I let go and something goes wrong?" And Spirit answers very gently, "Be still and know that I am God." Not be still and do nothing forever. Be still long enough to remember who governs. When this yielding becomes habitual, when it becomes the atmosphere of your life, something remarkable happens. Reaction slows down, not because you are controlling it, but because there is no longer the same urgency. Judgment loses its speed. It no longer leaps forward instantly, demanding response. And in that slowing, a pause appears. This pause is the most important doorway in spiritual living. The pause is not indecision. It is not suppression. It is not avoidance. It is the moment in which the ego is not allowed to speak first. James tells us, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. He was not giving social advice. He was revealing spiritual sequence. Hearing precedes speaking. Listening precedes action. God precedes reaction. When you live in preparedness of consciousness, you do not rush to correct, explain, defend, or judge. You pause not dramatically, not visibly, but inwardly. And in that pause, something else takes the stage. Not thought, not memory, not strategy, presence. And from presence, the right word or no word emerges. Sometimes the pause yields silence. Sometimes it yields a simple boundary. Sometimes it yields compassion. Sometimes it yields distance. Sometimes it yields forgiveness without conversation. But whatever comes, it comes without strain. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Reaction is heavy. Judgment is heavy. Control is heavy. But the movement of spirit is light. Now, let us be very clear. This pause will feel uncomfortable at first. The ego hates it. The ego wants speed. It wants certainty. It wants closure. It wants to be right quickly. And so it will tempt you to act prematurely, to speak prematurely, to judge prematurely. But every time you honor the pause, you weaken the ego's claim to authority. And slowly, sometimes very slowly, you discover that reactivity is no longer your default. Peace becomes quicker than judgment. Listening becomes faster than opinion. And one day, you realize that the thing which once triggered you no longer has the same hold. Not because the world changed, but because government changed. You no longer live as a resident of reaction. You live as a citizen of the kingdom. And that is the one move. Now, in order to understand why this pause has such power, why yielding before reaction can dissolve judgment, we must see where human beings ordinarily place their reliance. For judgment is not a habit that appears suddenly. It grows out of the level of power we are trusting. All of us, without exception, have moved through certain stages of reliance, and there is no shame in any of them. Each has been necessary. Each has had its place, but none of them until we reach the last can give us peace. In the beginning, we relied almost entirely on matter, on physical force, on conditions, on environment, on protection through things. If danger appeared, we looked for material defense. If sickness appeared, we looked for material remedies. If lack appeared, we looked for material accumulation. At this level, judgment is unavoidable because matter appears fragmented. It appears competitive. It appears limited. And therefore, the mind must constantly evaluate. This is good. This is bad. This is safe. This is dangerous. This is mine. This is yours. Living by matter requires vigilance. Then, for many of us, a great shift occurred. We discovered the power of mind. We learned that thought influences experience, that fear produces illness, that resentment poisons the body, that right thinking can improve circumstances. And this was a great step forward. But notice something very important. Judgment did not disappear at the mental level. It merely became more refined. Now we judged thoughts instead of people. Now we evaluated attitudes instead of conditions. Now we tried to correct life by correcting consciousness, yet still from a personal standpoint. And so we found ourselves judging ourselves for wrong thinking, judging others for unconsciousness, judging situations as negative or low vibration. It was still judgment, only dressed in spiritual language. And this is why many sincere students find themselves exhausted even after years of metaphysical study, because managing thought is still labor. Correcting consciousness from the standpoint of ego is still control. And control, no matter how elevated, cannot bring peace. Then comes the revelation that changes everything. The Master did not teach reliance on matter. He did not teach reliance on mind. He taught reliance on spirit. It is the spirit that quickeneth. The flesh profiteth nothing. And notice he did not say the flesh is evil. He said it profits nothing. It cannot give life. It cannot give peace. Nor did he say right thinking quickeneth. He said spirit. And here is where the sword truly begins its work. Because spirit reliance requires the surrender of both material and mental power as primary authorities. Spirit reliance says, I will not live by physical might. I will not live by mental manipulation. I will live by the grace of God. This is why the scripture tells us, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. Now let us see how judgment fits into this. At the material level, judgment is survival. At the mental level, judgment is correction. At the spiritual level, judgment is unnecessary because spirit does not react. Spirit does not evaluate appearances. Spirit does not defend itself. Spirit is, when you rely on spirit, you do not ask, who is wrong here? You ask nothing at all. You listen, you yield, you wait, and in that waiting, the false authority of appearances dissolves. This is why Jesus could stand before hatred without hatred, before accusation without defense, before betrayal without retaliation. He was not relying on matter or mind. He was abiding in spirit. I can, of mine own self, do nothing. That statement alone contains the end of judgment. As long as you believe you must do something of yourself, fix, correct, judge, manage, judgment will remain your companion. But when you accept that life is governed by a wisdom beyond personal thought, judgment loses its role. And this is where many resist, because spirit reliance feels like loss of control. It feels risky. It feels like stepping into the unknown, but it is not unknown. It is home. Underneath are the everlasting arms. Spirit reliance does not mean you become passive. It means you stop initiating from fear. It means action flows from listening rather than urgency. It means response arises without reaction, and judgment cannot survive there. Judgment needs mental commentary. Judgment needs narrative. Judgment needs comparison. Spirit needs none of these. So, when you find judgment arising in you, and you will do not fight it, do not condemn it, simply recognize what level of reliance is active. Ask quietly, am I trying to live by matter, by mind, or am I willing right now to let spirit be my life? That question alone begins the shift. And when spirit becomes the ground of your being, judgment no longer needs to be managed. It simply finds no place to land. Now we come to a place where many sincere students are puzzled and some are discouraged. They say, I know I am supposed to love. I know I should forgive. I know I should not judge. And yet, in the moment when I am hurt, betrayed, insulted, or frightened, love seems very far away. And so they try to love, they try to forgive, they try to respond spiritually, and they fail, and then they judge themselves for failing. Let us be very clear about this. Trying to love is not love. It is effort, and effort belongs to the personal sense of self. Love, as taught by the Master, is not a virtue to be practiced. It is a state of consciousness revealed when the false self is absent. God is love. He did not say God commands love. He did not say God rewards love. He said God is love. Therefore, love does not originate in you as a person. It is not produced by your will. It is not sustained by your discipline. Love appears only when the personal sense of I is no longer managing the situation. This is why trying to love in moments of emotional charge is so exhausting. You are asking the human self, already wounded, already frightened, already reactive, to produce divine consciousness, and it cannot do so. That is why Jesus never said, try to love your enemies. He said, love your enemies. And that statement was not instruction, it was revelation. He was revealing what happens when one abides in God consciousness. In that consciousness, enemies are not seen as enemies. Now, consider this carefully. Judgment and effort always travel together. The moment you say, I must love, there is already judgment, present judgment of yourself for not loving, judgment of the situation as wrong, judgment of the other as undeserving. Love cannot enter where judgment has already claimed authority. This is why non-reaction is the doorway, not effort. When the Master was reviled, he did not first decide to love. He did not evaluate the situation and choose compassion. He abided, and from that abiding, love appeared as the natural atmosphere. I and my Father are one. That statement does not leave room for personal effort. Now let us be honest. When someone harms you, the personal self reacts. This is not sin. This is not failure. This is conditioning. And the infinite way does not ask you to suppress that reaction. It asks you to not act from it. The moment you stop trying to correct yourself, something remarkable happens. The struggle quiets. The inner noise settles. And in that stillness, another presence becomes discernible. Be still and know that I am God. Notice it does not say, be loving and know that I am God. It says, be still. Stillness is the sword that cuts through judgment. When you are still, judgment cannot sustain itself because judgment requires motion, mental motion, emotional motion, narrative motion. Stillness interrupts the entire mechanism. And here is the great secret. Love is not what you do after stillness. Love is what remains when stillness removes everything else. You do not need to love your enemy. You need to cease defending the personal self. Love will be there when the defender steps aside. This is why forgiveness in the spiritual sense is not an act. It is a recognition. Forgiveness says, this never had the power I thought it had. Forgiveness says, nothing real was harmed. Forgiveness says, I release this because there is nothing here to hold. And this cannot be done by effort. It can only be revealed by grace. Grace does not arrive because you earned it. Grace arrives because you stopped interfering. My grace is sufficient for thee. Sufficient for what? Sufficient for the moment when you cannot love. Sufficient for the moment when judgment feels justified. Sufficient for the moment when reaction feels automatic. Grace does not ask you to be better. It asks you to be still. So when the next moment of judgment arises, and it will do not ask, how can I love this? Ask instead, can I pause long enough for God to be present here? That pause is everything. And in that pause, love does not have to be manufactured. It reveals itself as the natural state of being. Now we arrive at the place where many misunderstand the Master's words, and because they misunderstand them, they fear them. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And they ask themselves, how can love bring a sword? How can gentleness divide? How can peace disturb? Yet this sword wounds no one. It sheds no blood. It leaves no scar. And still, it cuts more deeply than any weapon ever formed by human hands. This sword cuts illusion from reality. It separates what seems to be from what is. And because we have lived so long identified with what seems to be, with appearances, roles, identities, histories, and reactions, the cutting can feel unsettling. But it is not destructive. It is liberating. This sword does not cut people from people. It cuts false dependence from consciousness. It cuts the belief that matter sustains us. It cuts the belief that thought governs us. It cuts the belief that another person has the power to disturb our peace. And most importantly, it cuts the personal sense of I away from the throne of authority. The word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit. Notice what is divided, not flesh, not circumstance, not relationship, but soul and spirit. The human sense of self is separated from the divine sense of being. This is why the sword feels disruptive, because the soul, the personal self, has ruled unchecked for a long time. It has judged, it has reacted, it has defended, it has justified itself. And now it is being gently but firmly relieved of authority. Judgment cannot survive this cutting. Why? Because judgment belongs to the soul. Judgment arises from identity. Who am I? What am I protecting? What do I stand to lose? Spirit asks none of these questions. Spirit does not need to defend itself because spirit cannot be threatened. This is why Jesus could say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That statement was not moral superiority. It was perception. He was seeing from spirit, not from soul. From spirit, harm is ignorance, not evil. From spirit, attack is confusion, not power. From spirit, judgment dissolves, because nothing real has been violated. And here is the crucial point. The sword does not remove problems. It removes the belief that problems have authority. When the sword cuts, it does not change the external scene immediately. It changes who you think you are within it. And when that changes, the scene must follow or fade. This is why spiritual non-reaction is not passivity. It is alignment. When you do not react, you are not submitting to evil. You are refusing to grant it reality. Reaction says, this has power. Non-reaction says, this has appearance only. And the sword ensures that this distinction becomes clear. Now understand this well. The sword will sometimes separate you from old ways of relating. It may separate you from conversations built on judgment. It may separate you from identities built on grievance. It may even separate you from versions of yourself you once defended fiercely. But it will never separate you from love. What it cuts away was never love. It was attachment masquerading as love. It was fear masquerading as concern. It was judgment masquerading as discernment. The sword is merciful because it ends struggle. And once the cutting has taken place, peace is no longer something you pursue. It is something you discover has been there all along. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth. The world gives peace conditionally. If things go right, if people behave, if circumstances improve. Spirit gives peace unconditionally, because nothing real can be disturbed. This is the peace that follows the sword, not the peace of avoidance, not the peace of control, but the peace of knowing. Now here we must pause, because the human mind raises an objection almost immediately. It says, if I do not react, I will be overrun. If I do not defend myself, I will be harmed. If I do not answer accusation, injustice will prevail. And so non-reaction is mistaken for weakness, passivity, or even cowardice. But nothing could be further from the truth. Non-reaction is not weakness. It is dominion. Weakness reacts because it believes it must. Weakness believes it is vulnerable. Weakness believes that something outside itself has power over its life, its peace, or its supply. Dominion rests. Dominion listens. Dominion abides. The meek shall inherit the earth. That statement has puzzled many, because meekness has been confused with timidity. But meekness is not timorous. It is power under divine government. It is strength that does not need to prove itself. When Jesus stood silent before Pilate, it was not because he had no answer. It was because no answer was required. The moment required presence, not argument. Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. That is dominion. Dominion does not argue with appearances. Dominion does not correct personalities. Dominion does not attempt to manage outcomes. Dominion recognizes that there is one power, and that power is not personal. Non-reaction is the outward sign that this recognition has taken place within. Now let us be very clear. Non-reaction does not mean inaction. It means that action does not arise from fear, resentment, or the need to protect identity. Action, when it comes, flows from clarity. And sometimes the clearest action is silence. Sometimes it is withdrawal. Sometimes it is a word spoken without heat. Sometimes it is firm, unmistakable direction, yet without malice. What is absent is personal struggle. Judgment always struggles. It wrestles with appearances. It tries to balance scales. It attempts to assign blame. Dominion does none of this. Dominion knows that the scales belong to God. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. This does not mean punishment. It means restoration of balance. It means truth asserting itself without human interference. When you do not react, you are not saying, this is acceptable. You are saying, this does not govern me. And that distinction is everything. Reaction hands authority to the very thing you wish to overcome. Non-reaction withdraws that authority. This is why Jesus could say, resist not evil. He was not saying evil should be tolerated. He was saying evil should not be granted the dignity of opposition. Resistance gives reality to the thing resisted. Non-reaction exposes it as insubstantial. And here is something very important to understand. Non-reaction cannot be practiced as a technique. If you attempt to suppress reaction, you are still reacting only inwardly. That suppression will harden into resentment. Non-reaction must come from realization, not restraint. It comes when you see, truly see, that there is nothing to defend, that the self which is real is untouched, that your life is not housed in reputation, body, circumstance, or opinion. Your life is hid with Christ in God. What can touch that? Once this is glimpsed, even briefly, something loosens. The urgency to respond fades. The need to correct dissolves. And you find yourself standing where power actually resides. This is why the world so often misunderstands spiritual authority. It looks for force. God reveals presence. The world looks for dominance. God reveals dominion. And dominion never raises its voice. Now we come to the root of the matter. Judgment is not a moral failure. It is not a character flaw. Judgment is a symptom. And until we understand what it is a symptom of, we will continue trying to treat it at the surface. Judgment is the sign that identity has slipped. The moment you feel compelled to judge yourself, another, a situation, you may be certain of one thing. You are no longer resting in your true identity, because the Christ does not judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And righteous judgment is not judgment at all. It is discernment without condemnation. It is seeing without personal involvement. False identity says, this affects me. True identity says, I am not located here. Judgment arises only when you believe you are a separate self living in a dangerous universe, trying to secure safety, fairness, or worth. From that standpoint, judgment feels necessary, even virtuous. But the moment you remember, even faintly, I am not of this world, judgment loses its footing. Jesus did not refrain from judgment because he was virtuous. He refrained because there was no personal self left to be defended. And this is why judgment feels so convincing when it arises. It speaks with the voice of identity. I am right. I am wronged. I must respond. But identity is not established by reaction. Identity is revealed by stillness. When judgment appears, do not ask, how do I stop judging? Ask instead, who am I right now? That question, asked honestly, restores alignment faster than any effort to correct behavior. Now we must speak plainly about forgiveness, because it has been misunderstood perhaps more than any other spiritual principle. Forgiveness is not something you do to another. Forgiveness is something you realize about reality. Forgiveness does not say, you hurt me, but I will be kind. That is moral generosity. It has its place, but it is not spiritual forgiveness. Spiritual forgiveness says, nothing real was harmed. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That statement does not excuse behavior. It exposes its unreality. Forgiveness is the recognition that error has no creator, no law, no permanence. It is the understanding that ignorance is not power and therefore needs no resistance. This is why forgiveness heals the forgiver first, because it releases the belief that something external has authority over your peace. And this forgiveness cannot be forced. It comes only when the false self yields. You do not forgive by will. You forgive by awakening. At a certain point on this path, something very quiet happens. You notice that life no longer feels like a series of problems to be solved. The inner struggle eases. The constant commentary softens. You still act. You still speak. You still decide. But there is no longer the sense that everything depends on you. This is abiding. Abide in me, and I in you. Abiding is not concentration. It is not effort. It is consent. It is the willingness to let life be lived from a deeper source than personal thought. And from this abiding, judgment does not need to be resisted. It simply fades from relevance. The world teaches defense. Protect yourself, prove yourself, secure yourself. Spirit teaches something radically different. Take no thought for your life. Not because life is unimportant, but because it is already sustained. Living without defense does not mean living without wisdom. It means wisdom is no longer driven by fear. You will find that when defense drops away, clarity increases. Right action becomes obvious. Boundaries appear naturally, without resentment. Defense is loud. Wisdom is quiet. Now we return to where we began, the sword. The sword does not remain forever. Its work is temporary. Once illusion has been severed from reality, the sword rests. What remains is peace. Not emotional peace, not circumstantial peace, but the peace that comes from knowing there is only one life, one power, one presence, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. This peace does not depend on forgiveness practiced perfectly, nor judgment eliminated entirely. It depends on recognition that God is all, recognition that you are not separate, recognition that nothing real is threatened. And from this peace, love flows not as a duty, but as the natural fragrance of being. And now, let us end where all spiritual teaching must end, not with instruction, but with release. You were never meant to manage life. You were never meant to correct the world. You were never meant to perfect yourself. You were meant to rest in God. Son, all that I have is thine. Judgment falls away when you stop carrying the burden of being a separate self. Forgiveness becomes effortless when you no longer believe in personal injury. Non-reaction becomes natural when you trust the government of spirit. The sword has done its work. Nothing has been taken from you, only illusion. Remain here. Live here. Return here. Often. And let God be God.